There are many mysteries in Minecraft, but one of the oldest is yet to be solved. So it's time to dig deep and uncover the lost story of Minecraft's fossils. Billions of years ago, the overworld was generally quite similar to how it is today, in that there were many different biomes, plants, and animals. However, the specifics of all these different features of the overworld were vastly different back then. Take the landscapes for example. Back then, the world was made up of hundreds of massive mountainous islands, with dense jungles and lively forests on the coastline, and dead, dry deserts in the center. They also had a lot of glaciers back then. But enough on the land for now. What were the inhabitants of this land like? Well, just like today, there was a large variety of small animals in prehistoric Minecraft, and these animals range from tiny moths to giant bats to floating sentient blobs. Now, while those were all very intriguing, the more interesting mobs were the apex predators, as they were the rulers of this world. So here's who they were. First, there were the Wyverns. These were dragon-like creatures that ruled the skies of the Minecraft world with a tight grasp. They spent most of their days gliding in the air asleep. And that was because they needed to conserve energy, because during the night they would swoop down and hunt all other creatures when they were at their most vulnerable. But on the flip side to them were the Diatols. Now, the Diatols were massive snails who resided in the, not so big at the time, underground, and they spent most of their time burrowing caves searching for diamonds to eat. Now, they weren't all that aggressive, but when they did believe that their territory was being threatened, they would activate their shell's defenses, which made them almost unkillable. You see, their shells were made from the diamonds that they ate, so if anyone tried to attack them, their attacks would just be bounced off like a shield made from solid diamonds. And as such, it was very hard to attack the Diatol and win, hence why it ended up ruling the underground of the overworld. And finally, there were the Frostmaws. These were the giants of the world, who ruled over the massive Arctic regions, and they were very, very powerful. In fact, they were probably the strongest creature in all of Minecraft at that time. Now, they ate everything that entered the Arctic areas, from frozen fish to the flying wyverns. Everything was fair game for the Frostmaws. However, they did also need to eat some of the ice from their glaciers on occasion, as they needed to be very cold in order to stay alive. Now, while all these creatures may sound magical and mysterious, they were just the animals that lived in these prehistoric times. And so, their interaction with the world, with the apexes ruling it, there should have been very little change in the world for the next few billion years to come. Except, that's not quite what happened. As billions of years later, the Minecraft world had begun to change drastically, but also very slowly. You see, over a very long time, the ferocious Frostmaws had been eating away at the glaciers, which meant that slowly the glaciers began to melt, and as such the water levels of the world began to rise. Now, that can't be too bad, right? Wrong. Remember all those luscious jungles and forests that were on the coasts of these massive islands in Minecraft? Well, they were the home to 99% of all living things in the world at that time. And well, with the water level rising faster than these jungles were expanding, the jungles eventually started to submerge into the ocean. Now, that meant that all the creatures that lived there would be forced out of the safety of their jungles and forests and into the harsh areas of the deserts. Now, a really big problem with that is that in the deserts, there isn't exactly all that much food for everyone, and as such, the populations of these creatures started to decrease. However, when one started to decline, they all did, in a massive snowball effect, where not too long after being forced into the deserts, the amount of living creatures on the overworld was just a very small fraction of what they used to be. Even the wyverns started to die out, and they were meant to be the hunters of everyone else and the undefeatable. Also, all those underground Diatols that were meant to be unkillable had drowned, as the increased water flow had flooded many of their caves. But now, what was actually happening in those Arctic regions? Well, they were the main cause of this mass flooding, as they had been shrinking so much. And because of that, many of the Frostmaws had actually died out due to the heat of not being in the core areas of their glaciers. Eventually though, even with the reduced amount of Frostmaws, the entire Arctic region had either been eaten or thawed away, leading to very high water levels. But that didn't necessarily mean that the entire world was just going to be deserts from now on, even though on the surface it looked like they were the only places above water level. You see, at the core of these Arctic areas, there was still some land with dirt and water, just what was needed for life to thrive. However, these areas quickly became overrun with toxic trees that loved the cold. And because of those toxic trees, the water there eventually became toxic, and as such, no normal animal could live there, and that was terrible, as that meant that the few remaining creatures would be forced to stay in the deadly deserts, as there was nowhere for them to go. And so, over the next few centuries, many more of these prehistoric creatures would die out in the desert, or they would be killed in the toxic swampland looking for a new home. Also, many of the bones of these creatures would eventually fossilize in these deadly conditions. But overall, it was just a terrible time in the Minecraft world, and it would only be getting worse. You see, the overworld was starting to drift closer and closer towards the sun, which was causing its atmosphere to start being ripped apart. And if nothing was done soon, the atmosphere would be destroyed, which would kill any remaining creatures on the world, and it would probably be destroying the entire overworld. So it looked like that there was no way out of this deadly fate, as none of the creatures in the world at this time were nearly smart enough to solve this problem. But it was then that something changed. The overworld was trying to save itself, which it was trying to do by summoning the Enchanted Oriole Rock, which was a massive blue rock that had some of the most powerful magical properties in all of the universe. And well, when it arrived, it actually saved the overworld, but this all came at a very heavy cost. The Enchanted Oriole Rock was a massive meteor made from the uncontrollable magic of the cosmos, that when it landed, pushed the overworld backwards and put it on a trajectory away from the boiling sun. But in doing so, since it was made from uncontrollable magic, there were consequences of using it. Mainly that it sucked in all the weaker surface from the overworld, only leaving behind a rough area of the common stones. Now, that wasn't great, as it meant that all the sands from the deserts, and all the weaker stones, and all the creatures that were still alive, were dragged to their doom. But it was not bad for them, as everything that was taken in by this rock was transported to a parallel universe. Within this parallel universe, everything was very compressed, and so many blocks were set alight from all that pressure. Also, almost every form of life was killed very quickly due to that, with the only form of life remaining being the fungi, or the now burned green blobs. Also, some of those animals who had died there were actually fossilized very quickly because of how much pressure there was within the air. But on the bright side of all this, it did save the overworld. Also, that dimension, well, it was the Subscribether, the Nether. Now, let's go back to the overworld. The Enchanted Oriole Rock had imploded, and due to that implosion, most of the Enchanted Oriole Rock was taken into the Nether, but a few shards of it were left behind. So now the overworld was a desolate wasteland of rocks, but that was quickly going to change, as those few remaining shards in the overworld had magical abilities, and they were able to create new life. And so those shards, over the course of the next billion years, started to create a new overworld, one that wouldn't flood like the last one and would have much more variety in the layout of the land. Additionally, a thick layer of new stone was created that separated this new world from the old. But the bodies of some of these dead apex predators from the old world did get stuck in that stone, which over time created the fossils. And so that's how the overworld we know today was created. But not all these shards were used in that creation, as some were used as beacons of magic that gave the new creatures of this world magical powers. Meanwhile, other shards lay dormant under the ground, with a lot of power left untapped within. So what do you think would happen if one of the new magical creatures of this world discovered a shard of the Enchanted Oriole Rock? Would they gain the power to destroy their world and create a new? Well, you'll need to watch this video to find out.